By 1942, Axis bombing campaigns and ground invasions had reduced major cities across the globe to ash and concrete. The conflict posed an existential threat that physically dismantled the infrastructure of modern civilization. To counter this, 26 nations gathered in Washington to sign the Declaration of the United Nations. At this stage, the United Nations was strictly a temporary military alliance designed to win a war. There was no actual blueprint for a global government. But Allied leaders knew that once the Axis fell, a massive geopolitical vacuum would open up. The last time the world faced a similar void, after World War I, they built the League of Nations, an idealistic assembly that proved totally powerless to stop a second global collapse. Defeating the current enemy would mean very little if the victors couldn't engineer a permanent, resilient architecture to actively prevent World War III. President Franklin he envisioned a hardened, pragmatic alternative based on the realities of raw power. His initial concept relied on what he called the four policemen. The United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China would divide the globe into spheres of influence and actively patrol their respective regions. Under this framework, international order wouldn't be maintained by treaties alone. It would rely on a locked-in geopolitical monopoly on force. If a rogue state stepped out of line, these four powers would use their combined military muscle to disarm them. The challenge over the next 3 years was figuring out how to package this blunt autocratic mechanism into a legitimate international organization that the rest of the world would actually accept. Throughout a series of exclusive, closed-door summits in Quebec, Moscow, and Tehran, the major powers began sketching out this new world order. Before finalizing the political framework, Allied representatives launched a network of specialized institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Food and Agricultural Organization. These were engineered to serve as the economic life support systems for a post-war global economy. The actual political blueprint was drafted during the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in late 1944. Here, representatives from the US, UK, Soviet Union, and China sat down to hammer out the mechanics of collective security. They immediately faced a structural paradox. They needed to balance the military weight of the major powers against the diplomatic ideal that all sovereign nations are equal. Their solution, a broad General Assembly where member states voice concerns, and a heavily armed Security Council to enforce peace. This framework explicitly institutionalized global inequality. The smaller nations gained a platform for representation, and in exchange, the superpowers maintained the muscle required to actually keep the system intact. The final stress test for the Security Council's design happened at the Yalta Conference in early 1945. Behind closed doors, Roosevelt and Stalin clashed over voting procedures. The core issue was whether the Security Council could legally authorize military or economic action against one of its own permanent members. The impasse was resolved by installing the ultimate failsafe, the permanent veto. By granting this power to the permanent members, the architects guaranteed that the UN apparatus could never be legally weaponized against the vital interests of the nations that built it. This veto served as the uncompromising price of admission. Without that guarantee of sovereignty, the major powers would have walked away from the table, leaving the organization to collapse. Between April and June of 1945, representatives from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to refine the superpowers' rough draft into a functioning global apparatus. Over 2 months of intense negotiation, they codified a multi-tiered system. Alongside the Assembly and the Council, they integrated an International Court of Justice and an Economic and Social Council, locking the entire structure into the final United Nations Charter. But for the Roosevelt administration, a massive domestic hurdle remained. They were haunted by the memory of Woodrow Wilson, who helped build the League of Nations only to watch the U.S. Senate reject it, crippling the organization before it even started. To avoid repeating that failure, the administration engineered a highly calculated political campaign. They secured early bipartisan support from the Republican Party and pitched the UN as a practical, hard-nosed mechanism to prevent American soldiers from fighting another foreign war. The political maneuvering worked. In July 1945, the United States Senate overwhelmingly approved the UN Charter by a margin of 89-2. On October 24, 1945, the United Nations officially began operations as a pragmatic, shock-absorbing machine. It was engineered by the victors to absorb the tremors of a dangerous world and ensure their mutual survival.